The sound of my children's empty stomachs growling was louder than the bombs that had stopped falling 3 months ago. I stared at the cracked mirror in what used to be our bathroom, barely recognizing the hollow-eyed woman staring back at me. 26 years old, and I looked like I had lived 3 lifetimes. The woman I used to be, the one who sang lullabies and baked cookies, who believed in fairy tales and happy endings. She died the same day my husband did. My hands shook as I applied the cheap red lipstick I had found in the rubble of a destroyed pharmacy. Tonight, like every night for the past 6 months, I would walk down to the hotel district where foreign aid workers stayed. I would smile at men whose names I never learned, whose faces blurred together in my memory like watercolors in the rain. I would do things that made me want to scrub my skin raw afterward. Also, my 3 babies could have milk in the morning. Sophia, my 8-year-old, asked me yesterday why Mommy looks so sad all the time. How do you explain to a child that her mother's soul is breaking piece by piece? That the woman who used to dance around the kitchen while making breakfast now stands on street corners, waiting for strangers to notice her. Miguel, only 5, still asks when Daddy is coming home from his long trip, and I run to the bathroom to cry where he can't see me. The war took everything from us. Our home, our safety, our future. But what it couldn't take, I gave away willingly, one night at a time. My dignity, my self-respect, my belief that I deserved love, all sacrificed on the altar of survival. Because being a mother means doing whatever it takes, even when it destroys you from the inside out, even when you can barely look at your reflection without feeling sick. Little did I know that tonight would be different. Tonight, a man with kind eyes and gentle hands would walk into that hotel lobby and change everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, let me tell you how I ended up here. In this place where hope goes to die, where mothers become ghosts of themselves just to keep their children alive. The story I'm about to share with you isn't easy to tell, but it's one that needs to be heard. It's about the lengths a mother will go to protect her children, about losing yourself completely and somehow finding your way back to the light. It's about discovering that sometimes, when you think you've hit rock bottom, the ground gives way to reveal there's still further to fall. And sometimes, just sometimes, someone reaches down to pull you back up. My name is Elena, and this is the story of how I survived the unthinkable, how I found love when I thought I was unworthy of it, and how I learned that redemption isn't something you have to earn. Sometimes it's simply given, freely and without condition. Before we begin, I want you to know that every word of this is true. Every tear, every moment of despair, every glimpse of hope, it all happened exactly as I'm about to tell you. If this story touches your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Give it a thumbs up, and most importantly, leave a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. Your support means everything to me. And knowing that my story is reaching people all over the world gives me strength. Sometimes sharing our darkest moments can light the way for someone else who's struggling in the shadows. 3 years ago, if someone had told me I would end up selling my body to feed my children, I would have laughed in their face. 3 years ago, I was Elena Morales, wife to the most wonderful man in the world, mother to 3 beautiful children, living in a small but comfortable house on the outskirts of San Cristobal. We weren't rich, but we were happy. Daniel worked at the power plant, and I stayed home with the kids, tending our small garden and dreaming about the future we were building together. Our mornings started with coffee and quiet conversation while the children slept. Daniel would tell me about his plans to expand the garden, maybe get some chickens. I would share my dreams of opening a small restaurant someday, serving my grandmother's recipes to the whole town. Sophia was excelling in school, little Miguel was learning to ride his bike, and baby Carmen had just started walking. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and we were content. The first signs of trouble came slowly, like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. There were rumors of unrest in the capital, talk of government corruption and rebel groups forming in the mountains. Daniel would come home from work with worry lines creasing his forehead, speaking in hushed tones about supply shortages and workers being laid off. But we lived in our small bubble, believing that whatever was happening in the big cities wouldn't touch our quiet corner of the world. I remember the exact moment our bubble burst. It was a Tuesday morning in March, and I was hanging laundry on the line while Carmen played in the dirt at my feet. Sophia and Miguel were at school, and Daniel had left for work an hour earlier. The sound of military trucks rumbling down our street made me look up, my heart already beginning to race. Neighbors were coming out of their houses, pointing and whispering. Something was wrong. The trucks stopped at the community center, and men in uniforms began setting up tables and loudspeakers. Within an hour, every man between 80 and 45 in our town was being called to report for national service. They called it a draft. But we all knew what it really was. They were taking our husbands and sons to fight in a war that had finally reached our doorstep. Daniel came home that afternoon looking like he had aged 10 years in 8 hours. His hands shook as he held me, and I could feel his tears soaking into my hair. "They're giving us 3 days," he whispered. 3 days to get our affairs in order before we report for duty. We spent those 3 days holding each other, memorizing every detail of our normal life, trying to prepare the children for what was coming without terrifying them completely. The night before he left, we lay in bed talking until dawn, making promises we both knew might be impossible to keep. "Take care of our babies," he said, stroking my hair. "No matter what happens to me, promise me you'll keep them safe." I promised, never imagining what that promise would cost me, never imagining that keeping that promise would require me to lose myself completely. I can still see him walking away that morning, his shoulders straight and proud, even though I knew his heart was breaking. Sophia cried openly, understanding more than the younger ones about what was happening. McGill waved goodbye cheerfully, still believing Daddy was going on an adventure and would be back soon. Carmen reached her little arms toward the door long after he was gone, saying Dada over and over until I picked her up and held her close, both of us crying. For the first few months, we managed. Daniel had left us with some savings, and the government promised support payments for military families. I stretched every dollar, grew vegetables, traded with neighbors for what we needed. The children adjusted to their new routine, though they asked about Daddy every day. I wrote letters to Daniel whenever mail service was working, and occasionally we received word that he was alive and thinking of us. But as the months passed and the war escalated, everything began to crumble. The government payments stopped coming. The banks closed, the markets emptied of food, and what little remained cost more than we could afford. My savings dwindled to nothing, and still there was no word from Daniel. It was during this time, as I watched my children growing thinner and more listless each day, that I began to understand what desperation really meant. The day I realized we had no food left was the day I understood that good mothers sometimes have to do terrible things. I had been rationing our last bag of rice for 3 days, giving the children tiny portions while telling myself I wasn't hungry. When Carmen cried because her stomach hurt, when Miguel asked why we couldn't have the cookies I used to bake, when Sophia quietly gave me half of her meager dinner because she knew I was starving, that's when something inside me broke and reformed into something harder, more desperate. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door was the one who first suggested it. She found me crying in my kitchen, staring at our empty cupboards, and sat down beside me with a cup of tea made from herbs she'd foraged. "Mia," she said gently, "there are women in town who are finding ways to make money, ways to feed their families." The way she said it, I knew exactly what she meant, and the thought made me physically sick. But as Carmen cried from hunger in the other room, I felt something shift inside me. I fought against the idea for 2 more weeks, trying everything else I could think of. I sold my wedding ring, my grandmother's jewelry, everything of value we had left. I begged for work at every business that was still operating, but there were no jobs for anyone. I even considered stealing food from the aid distributions, but I couldn't bring myself to take from families who might be even worse off than we were. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday night when Sophia collapsed at school from hunger. The teacher, a kind woman named Miss Clara, brought her home and stayed with me while I tried to give my daughter sugar water to revive her. When Sophia opened her eyes and whispered, "Mama, I'm so hungry," I knew I was out of choices. Miss Clara held my hand and said words that still echo in my mind. "We all do what we have to do to survive. God understands." That night, after putting the children to bed, I walked to the Hotel International for the first time. My legs felt like they might give out with every step, and I turned back twice before finally forcing myself to push through the glass doors. The lobby was full of foreign aid workers, journalists, and contractors. Men with clean clothes and full bellies who looked at our devastated city like it was an adventure. I didn't know what I was doing, how any of it worked. I just stood there in my cleanest dress, trying not to shake, until an older woman approached me. Maria, I learned later, had been working these hotels for 6 months since her husband disappeared. She took me under her wing, taught me how to approach men, how to negotiate, how to smile even when I wanted to disappear. The first time is the hardest, she told me. After that, you learn to go somewhere else in your mind. The first man was a journalist from Germany. He was actually kind to me, which somehow made it worse. He treated me like a person, asked about my children, even gave me extra money for food. But when it was over, and I was walking home in the pre-dawn darkness, I felt like I had left pieces of my soul scattered on that hotel room floor. I stopped 3 times to throw up, my body rejecting what my mind had forced it to accept. I came home to find Sophia awake, waiting for me. "Where were you, Mama?" she asked. And I told her the lie I would tell 100 times over the next 2 years, that I had been cleaning offices downtown. She helped me count the money, her eyes wide at seeing more cash than we'd had in months. The next morning, I bought milk bread, eggs, and fruit, and watched my children eat with a hunger that broke my heart. For the first time in weeks, they smiled. That night, I stared at myself in the mirror and tried to recognize the woman looking back. I had crossed a line I never thought I would cross, become someone I never thought I could become. But my children had full bellies, and that had to be enough. It had to be worth it. Because if it wasn't worth it, if their survival wasn't worth my destruction, then I didn't know how I would live with what I had become. And so began the darkest chapter of my life. Every night, I would kiss my children goodnight, telling them I loved them more than anything in the world. Then I would walk to those hotels, smile at strangers, and sell pieces of myself to keep my family alive. During the day, I was Elena the mother, helping with homework and playing games. At night, I became someone else entirely, a ghost of myself, doing whatever it took to survive in a world that had forgotten how to be kind. 2 years, 730 days of walking to those hotels, of becoming someone I didn't recognize, of dying a little bit more each night. I learned to divide myself into Elena, the mother, who sang lullabies and helped with homework during the day, and the other Elena, the one who smiled at strangers and pretended their touch didn't make her skin crawl. The hardest part wasn't the physical acts or even the shame. It was maintaining the wall between these 2 versions of myself so my children would never know what their mother had become. I developed routines that kept me sane. After each night, I would come home and scrub my skin raw in our broken shower, trying to wash away not just the physical evidence, but the feeling of hands that weren't my husband's touching me. I would burn sage that Mrs. Rodriguez gave me, filling our little house with smoke that seemed to cleanse more than my soul. It cleansed my secrets. Then I would check on my children, adjusting their blankets, whispering apologies they would never hear. The money was enough to keep us fed, but barely. I saved every peso I could, dreaming of the day when the war would end and I could stop this life. I kept the money hidden in different places around our house, some in a coffee can buried in the garden, some sewn into the lining of my winter coat, some tucked behind a loose brick in the wall. It was my children's future, purchased with pieces of my soul. Sophia was growing up too fast, taking care of Miguel and Carmen when I was working late. At 10 years old, she had learned to cook simple meals, to quiet Carmen when she cried, to help Miguel with his reading. Sometimes I would catch her looking at me with eyes that seemed too knowing, too worried for a child her age. She never asked questions directly, but I could feel her watching me, trying to understand why her mother seemed so sad, why I jumped when anyone touched me unexpectedly. The other women who worked the hotels became my unlikely family. Maria taught me how to protect myself, how to read men's intentions, how to avoid the ones who became violent when they drank too much. Carmen, not my daughter, but a woman named after her, showed me which clients paid well and treated women with basic respect. We looked out for each other in a world that had forgotten we were human beings with families and stories and hearts that could break. There were moments of unexpected kindness that kept me from losing myself completely. A businessman from Canada who just wanted someone to talk to about his own children back home, an aid worker from Sweden who gave me medicine when Carmen had pneumonia, a journalist who showed me pictures of his wife and spoke about how much he missed her, treating me like a confidant rather than a commodity. These glimpses of humanity reminded me that not all men were predators, that somewhere in the world, good people still existed. But for every kind man, there were others who reminded me how dangerous my life had become. Men who didn't want to use protection. Men who became rough when I tried to set boundaries. Men who threatened me when I refused to do things that made me feel less than human. I learned to carry a small knife, to always tell Maria what I was going, to have escape routes planned from every hotel room. Survival became a skill I never wanted to master. The worst moments came when I least expected them. Running into Sophia's teacher at the market and having to explain why I was buying groceries at strange hours. Seeing the wife of Daniel's friend at the pharmacy and wondering if she could smell the shame on me. Having nightmares where Daniel came home and found out what I had become. The look of disgust and disappointment in his eyes, more terrifying than any physical danger I faced. I wrote letters to Daniel that I never sent, pouring out my guilt and desperation onto paper that I would burn afterward. My love, I would write, I am keeping my promise to protect our children, but I am losing myself in the process. I pray that you never find out what I have had to do. I pray that somehow you would understand that every choice I made was for them. These letters were my confessions, my therapy, my way of talking to the only man whose opinion had ever mattered to me. As the second year ended, I began to feel like I was disappearing entirely. The woman I had been before the war seemed like a character from a book I had read long ago. I couldn't remember what it felt like to be touched with love instead of transaction, to feel beautiful instead of used, to have value beyond what men would pay for my body. I was surviving, my children were thriving, but I was becoming a ghost in my own life. And then, on a night that started like every other night for the past 2 years, everything changed. March 15th will forever be etched in my memory as the night my life began to change. I had just finished with a client and was sitting in the hotel bar, counting my money and preparing to go home, when I noticed a man at the corner table who looked different from the others. He wasn't drinking heavily like most of the foreign workers did. He wasn't loudly discussing business deals or complaining about the local conditions. Instead, he sat quietly, reading what looked like a children's book and occasionally glancing at a photograph he kept beside his coffee cup. There was something about his stillness that caught my attention. In a room full of men who looked at women like me as entertainment or conquest, he seemed lost in his own world. When our eyes met across the room, he didn't look at me the way other men did, with calculation, desire, or dismissal. He looked at me like he was seeing a person, not a commodity. It had been so long since someone looked at me that way that I almost forgot how to respond. I should have left. My routine was to go straight home after working, to shower away the night and check on my children. But something made me stay. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the gentle way he smiled when he caught me looking at him again. When he gestured to the empty chair at his table, I found myself walking over, breaking every rule I had established for my own safety and sanity. "I'm James," he said, standing up when I approached, a gesture of respect I hadn't experienced in 2 years. His voice was warm, with an American accent that reminded me of the movies I used to watch with Daniel on Sunday afternoons. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but you look like you have something heavy on your mind." I almost laughed at the understatement, but there was something in his tone that made me believe he genuinely cared about the answer. I told him my name was Elena, my Heyo name, not the fake one I usually gave clients. We talked for an hour about nothing and everything. He told me he was an engineer, here to help rebuild the power grid, and that he had been in our country for 3 weeks. He showed me the photograph beside his coffee, his daughter back in Texas, about Sophia's age, holding a trophy from her soccer team. The way his whole face lit up when he talked about her made my chest ache with recognition. "You have children too," he said, and it wasn't a question. Something in my expression must have given it away. When I nodded, he asked me their names, their ages, what they liked to do. For the first time in 2 years, I talked about Sophia, Miguel, and Carmen as a proud mother, not as a woman desperate to explain why she was selling herself to feed them. James listened like their stories mattered, like I mattered beyond what service I could provide. When closing time came, he didn't ask me to go to his room. Instead, he asked if he could walk me home, just to make sure I was safe. The request was so unexpected that I didn't know how to respond. Men didn't care about my safety, they cared about their own satisfaction. But James waited patiently while I processed this kindness, and eventually I found myself nodding. We walked through the empty streets, talking about our children, our hopes for when the war would end, the small beautiful things that still existed in our broken world. At my door, he didn't try to kiss me or invite himself in. He just said, "Thank you for letting me walk you home, Elena." It's been a long time since I've had a real conversation with someone. As he turned to leave, I found myself asking when I would see him again. "Tomorrow," he said simply. "Same place, same time. If you'd like." It wasn't a transaction or a demand, it was an invitation, given freely with no expectation of anything in return. I spent that night staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what had happened. For 2 years, I had perfected the art of disconnecting from my clients, of being present physically while sending my mind somewhere else entirely. But James had demanded nothing from me except conversation, had given me something I thought was lost forever. The feeling of being seen as a whole person. It was dangerous to hope, I reminded myself. Men like James didn't fall for women like me, women who had done what I had done to survive. But the next night, he was there waiting for me, and the night after that, slowly, carefully, he began to chip away at the walls I had built around my heart. He told me about his life in America, his job, his daughter Sarah, who was being raised by his sister after his wife died in a car accident 3 years earlier. He shared his loneliness, his guilt about traveling so much for work, his dream of rebuilding not just power grids but hope in places that had lost it. And little by little, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, I deserved kindness too. 3 months into our nightly conversations, James asked me a question that changed everything. "Elena, what did you do before the war?" It was such a simple question, but no one had asked me about the woman I used to be in so long that I had almost forgotten she existed. I told him about my dreams of opening a restaurant, about the garden Daniel and I tended together, about the mother I used to be who baked cookies and sang while she cooked. As I spoke, I watched something shift in James's eyes, recognition, perhaps, of the person I could be again. He started bringing me small gifts, not the expensive jewelry or perfume that clients sometimes offered, but meaningful things. A notebook where I could write down my grandmother's recipes, coloring books and crayons for my children, a small plant from my windowsill, telling me that every home deserves something growing in it. These gestures were more intimate than anything physical I had shared with anyone since Daniel died, because they acknowledged who I was beyond my desperation. I found myself looking forward to seeing him in ways that terrified me. When he didn't show up one night because of work obligations, I felt a disappointment so sharp it reminded me how dangerous it was to care about someone again. I had learned to survive by feeling as little as possible, by keeping everyone at a distance. James was asking me to risk everything, my carefully constructed emotional walls, my survival mechanisms, my heart that I had thought was too broken to ever love again. The night he kissed me, we had been talking about music. He had asked what songs I used to sing to my children, and I found myself humming a lullaby my mother sang to me. He listened with his eyes closed, and when I finished, he said, "Elena, you have the most beautiful voice I've ever heard." Before I could tell him all the reasons why that wasn't true, why I wasn't beautiful anymore, his lips were on mine, gentle and reverent, like I was something precious rather than something broken. But with love came the crushing weight of truth. How could I let him care about me without telling him what I had become? Every night I didn't go to the hotels meant less money for my family, but every night I spent with James instead felt like coming back to life. The guilt was overwhelming, guilt about the other women who depended on clients I was no longer taking, guilt about my children whose future depended on money I was no longer earning, guilt about deceiving the first man in years who had shown me genuine kindness. James began asking to meet my children, to see where I lived, to become part of my real life instead of just my hotel life. Each request filled me with both longing and terror. I wanted him to know Sophia, Miguel and Carmen. They were the best parts of me. The proof that, despite everything, I was still capable of love and goodness. But I was terrified of what he would think when he saw how we lived. Terrified that my children might accidentally reveal something about my nighttime absences. The decision was taken out of my hands when Miguel got sick with a fever that wouldn't break. I had to cancel our meeting to take care of him. But James showed up at my door anyway with medicine he had gotten from the aid station where he worked. Seeing him in my home, gentle and natural with my children, was both the most wonderful and most terrifying moment of my life. Sophia was immediately charmed by his stories about America. Miguel let him read bedtime stories in his funny accented Spanish. Even baby Carmen reached for him with the trust that children have for genuinely good people. After the children were asleep, James and I sat on my small porch, and he said the words I had been both longing for and dreading. Elena, I love you. I love your strength, your devotion to your children, your ability to find beauty in the darkest places. I want to take care of you, all of you. My heart soared and shattered at the same time. How could I accept love from someone who didn't know the truth about what I had done to survive? That night, I made the hardest decision of my life. I told him everything. About the hotels, about the men, about what I had done for 2 years to keep my children alive. I watched his face as I spoke, waiting for the disgust, the disappointment, the inevitable rejection. Instead, I saw pain, not for himself, but for me. Elena, he said, taking my hands in his, you are the strongest, most loving woman I have ever met. What you did wasn't shameful. It was heroic. You saved your family. When he asked me to marry him and come to America with my children, I couldn't believe it was real. I want to give you the life you deserve, he said. I want to help you build that restaurant, to watch your children grow up safe and loved, to show you every day that you are worthy of everything good in this world. As I said yes through my tears, I felt something I thought was lost forever, hope for a future where my past didn't define me, where love was possible again, where my children could have the life I had always dreamed of giving them. Looking back now, 5 years later, as I write this from the kitchen of my restaurant in Houston, watching James help Miguel with his homework while Sophia teaches Carmen to make tortillas, I sometimes can barely believe this is my life. The woman who walked those hotel corridors feels like someone from another lifetime. Yet she is still part of me, the part that taught me I was capable of anything for my children, that showed me strength I didn't know I possessed. The trauma of those years didn't disappear overnight. There were nights when James would reach for me and I would freeze, my body remembering different hands, different intentions. There were days when I felt like I didn't deserve the happiness that surrounded me, when the guilt of my past threatened to drown out the joy of my present, but James was patient, and therapy helped, and slowly, I learned to forgive myself for doing what I had to do to survive. My children thrived in America in ways I had only dreamed possible. Sophia is now 15, captain of her soccer team, dreaming of becoming a doctor. Miguel 12, builds robots and talks about becoming an engineer like James. Carmen, now 8, has never known hunger or fear, has never seen her mother as anything other than strong and loved. They call James Papa now, and he loves them as fiercely as if they were born to him. Sometimes I watch him with them and remember that night in the hotel when I first saw him looking at his daughter's photograph, and I know that we were all meant to find each other, even in the darkest place imaginable. This is why I share my story, not for pity, but for hope, because somewhere tonight there is a mother making impossible choices, a woman who thinks she is beyond saving, someone who believes their past has disqualified them from love. I want them to know that redemption is possible, that love doesn't require you to be perfect, and that sometimes the people who save us are waiting in the places we least expect to find them. Your story isn't over, no matter how dark it seems right now. Keep fighting, keep hoping, keep believing that better days are coming.